On a clear night in the autumn of 1903, a boy of 13 stood on the hill behind his grandfather's house in Providence, Rhode Island, and pointed a small telescope at the sky. The boy was thin, pale, already old in a way that had nothing to do with years. His name was Howard Phillips Lovecraft. What he saw through that lens would shape everything he believed, everything he wrote, and every sleepless night he spent walking the streets of Providence for the rest of his life. What he saw was distance, not the comfortable distance of a landscape or a horizon, but the kind of distance that makes the mind go quiet. Saturn hung in the eyepiece, banded and ringed, impossibly far away and impossibly indifferent to the boy staring up at it from a New England hilltop. Beyond Saturn lay the fixed stars, each one a sun, most of them larger than the one that warmed his face during the day. And beyond those stars, more stars, receding into a darkness that had no end. The numbers in his astronomy books were not abstractions. They were statements about what was actually real. The light reaching his eye from certain of those points had been travelling since before human civilization existed. Some of those stars had already died, their light a message from a corpse, arriving millions of years too late to mean anything to anyone. The boy understood this. He had been reading about astronomy since he was 12, consuming every text he could find with the intensity of someone who has discovered the one subject that makes the world legible. Within a year, he would begin writing a regular astronomy column for the Providence Tribune, and later for the Pawtuxet Valley Gleaner and the Providence Evening News, demonstrating a command of scientific concepts remarkable for his age. But there is a difference between understanding a fact and feeling it settle into your bones. That night on the hill, or one very like it, something took root in Howard Lovecraft that never left him. The universe was not built for human comfort. It was not built for anything. It simply existed, vast beyond reckoning, operating according to laws that had nothing to do with the hopes and terrors of the small creatures who had briefly appeared on the surface of one unremarkable world. He had been born on August 20th, 1890, at 194 Angel Street, in the house of his maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. Providence was the only city Lovecraft ever truly loved, and in some sense it was the only place he ever fully inhabited. The house on Angel Street was large, comfortable, well-appointed, and full of books. Whipple Phillips was a prosperous businessman with wide-ranging interests, a man who read history and science, who told his grandson stories drawn from the Arabian Nights with a vividness that made the boy feel as though the walls of the parlour had dissolved and the deserts of the ancient world had come flooding in. The library became young Howard's sanctuary. He read without supervision and without plan, following his curiosity through volumes of classical literature, Roman history, chemistry, and the Gothic tales that gave him his earliest taste of the literature of the strange. By the age of 6, he was writing his own stories. By 8, he had discovered chemistry and built a small laboratory. The life of the mind was not a retreat for him. It was the first and most real thing he knew. His father offered a different education entirely. Winfield Scott Lovecraft was a travelling salesman for the Gorham Manufacturing Company, a silverware firm based in Providence. In April of 1893, when Howard was 2 years old, Winfield suffered a psychotic episode in a hotel room in Chicago. He was brought back to Providence and committed to Butler Hospital, the city's institution for the treatment of mental illness. The diagnosis was general paresis, the terminal neurological stage of syphilis. Winfield Lovecraft spent the remaining 5 years of his life in that hospital, his mind deteriorating in ways his young son was shielded from understanding. He died on July 19, 1898. Howard was 7. The boy was told his father had suffered a kind of nervous paralysis brought on by overwork. Whether he accepted this story fully, or whether something in him sensed the darker truth, we cannot know for certain. What we can see is the mark it left on his imagination. His fiction, when it came, would be saturated with images of inherited corruption, taints carried in bloodlines, minds that crack under the pressure of knowledge they were never designed to hold, ancestral secrets that surface without warning and destroy the person who discovers them. These are not merely literary conventions. They are the recurring anxieties of a man who grew up in the shadow of a father, consumed from within by a disease that devoured reason itself. His mother, Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft, filled the space that Winfield's collapse had opened, but she filled it in ways that complicated everything. She was by multiple accounts a difficult, emotionally intense woman who both adored her son and burdened him with an attention that left little room for ordinary childhood. She kept him largely isolated from other children. She is reported to have told him he was ugly, reinforcing a conviction the boy was already developing that he was fundamentally different from the people around him, that he belonged to a separate order of being. She dressed him in clothing appropriate for a much younger child, well past the age when it would have drawn comment. The relationship was one of fierce, suffocating closeness, and its effects lasted decades. Sarah would eventually suffer her own breakdown and be committed to Butler Hospital, the same institution where her husband had died. She entered Butler in 1919 and died there on May 24, 1921. The symmetry is almost too precise. Both parents, lost to the same building, their minds undone in ways their son could only imagine and dread. Between these losses, Lovecraft built the interior world that would sustain him. His education was formal only in the loosest sense. He attended Hope Street High School in Providence, but his attendance was irregular, disrupted by periods of what he described as near-complete nervous collapse. In 1908, at the age of 18, he suffered a breakdown severe enough to prevent him from graduating. He never received his diploma. He never attended Brown University, though he lived close enough to see its campus from his window, to hear the bells from its chapel, to watch its students walk the streets that he walked alone in the early hours of the morning. This failure haunted him for the rest of his life. It was not merely the absence of a credential. It was the confirmation of a pattern he was already beginning to recognize, that his mind and the world operated on incompatible terms, that the intensity of his inner life came at the cost of his ability to navigate the structures that ordinary people moved through without difficulty. He was a man of formidable intellectual capacity who could not manage the ordinary demands of institutional life, and the gap between what he knew himself capable of and what the world recognized him as became one of the defining tensions of his existence. Then, in 1904, came the blow that reshaped everything. Whipple Van Buren Phillips died. The death was devastating on its own terms. The loss of the person who had been more father than grandfather, the man who had told him stories and opened the library and made the world feel large and full of wonders. But the material consequences were equally destructive. Whipple's estate was mismanaged and largely lost. The family could no longer afford the house at 454 Angel Street. Howard and his mother moved to smaller rented quarters at 598 Angel Street. Lovecraft wrote about the loss of that house for the rest of his life, returning to it in letters decades later with a specificity of grief that suggests the wound never closed. The house was not merely a house, it was the last physical anchor to a world of security, learning, and continuity that the Phillips family had represented. Its loss confirmed what the telescope had already been teaching him. The things we value most, stability, belonging, the sense that we occupy a place in a world that makes sense, exist at the mercy of forces entirely indifferent to whether they survive. What followed was a period of almost total withdrawal. From roughly 1908 to 1914, Lovecraft lived as a recluse, shut away in his mother's house, reading, sleeping through the days, and emerging only at night. He described himself later as a hermit, and the word is not much of an exaggeration. He wrote amateur poetry in deliberate imitation of the 18th century styles he admired, modelling his diction on Dryden and Pope as though the previous 150 years of literary history had been a mistake he could correct by ignoring it. The poetry was competent and almost entirely lifeless. His voice had not yet found its subject. But the night walks were something else. Lovecraft would leave his house after dark and walk for hours through the colonial streets of Providence's east side. Past the old gambrel-roofed houses on Benefit Street, past the First Baptist Church, built in 1775, past the John Brown House, which he considered the finest example of Georgian architecture in the country. Through silent neighbourhoods where the 18th century seemed to linger in the brickwork and the iron railings, as though time had pooled in certain corners and refused to drain away. These walks were not exercise, they were a form of habitation. Lovecraft was occupying a version of Providence that existed before industrialization and immigration had transformed the city into something he found chaotic and threatening. He was walking through the past, and in the past he found a temporary refuge from a present he could neither master nor accept. The night was his element. He did his best thinking under a sky full of stars, the same stars that had first shown him the truth about the scale of things. There is something important in this preference. Walking at 3 a.m. through streets built by men dead for 2 centuries, beneath a cosmos that did not know or care that either he or they had ever existed, Lovecraft occupied the precise space from which his philosophy would emerge. Below him, the human effort to build something that endures. Above him, the void that renders all such efforts temporary. He did not yet have the language or the literary form to express what he felt in that space. But the feeling was already complete. In 1914, the isolation began to crack. Lovecraft discovered amateur journalism, a sprawling network of self-published magazines whose contributors debated everything from politics to prosody and corresponded with one another in letters of sometimes extraordinary length. For a man who had spent 6 years in near-total seclusion, the amateur press was oxygen. It gave him readers. It gave him arguments. It gave him a reason to write prose rather than imitation Pope. He threw himself into the community with an energy that surprised everyone who knew him, writing editorials, critiques, and essays on subjects ranging from astronomy to the correct usage of English grammar. He corresponded furiously, producing letters that ran to thousands of words, letters that would eventually fill 5 thick volumes of selected correspondence published after his death, and that constitute one of the most remarkable bodies of personal writing in American literature. In these letters, more than in any other medium, Lovecraft thought aloud. He worked out his positions on science, philosophy, art, and the nature of reality with a candour and specificity that his fiction, bound by the conventions of the weird tale, could not always accommodate. And it was through the discipline of regular publication that he discovered the possibility of writing fiction worth reading. In 1917 he produced Dagon, a brief, fierce story about a man who encounters evidence of a civilization older than humanity on a stretch of seafloor risen temporarily above the waves. The story was overwrought in places and derivative in others. But the central idea was already fully formed. Something existed in the universe that was older, larger, and more powerful than the human species. It did not hate us. It did not love us. It did not know we were here. And the discovery of its existence was enough to destroy a mind. The man who wrote that story was 26, financially dependent, socially marginal, and possessed of a vision of the universe that most people would find intolerable. He had arrived at this vision not through formal education or systematic philosophy, but through the slow accumulation of loss, solitude, and a childhood encounter with the night sky that had never stopped reverberating. A father devoured by madness in an institution. A grandfather whose death meant the end of everything stable. A mother whose love was indistinguishable from confinement. And a telescope that had shown him, at 13, that the cosmos was not a home. These were the raw materials of a philosophy that did not yet have a name. The name would come later. The ideas behind it were already in place, waiting in the dark streets of Providence for the fiction that would finally give them form. Lovecraft did not arrive at his philosophy by reading philosophers. He arrived at it by reading scientists and then thinking harder about what they had said than most of them were willing to. The distinction matters. He was not a man who sat down with Plato's dialogues and worked his way forward through the Western tradition in an orderly fashion. He was a man who picked up a book about astronomy, or chemistry, or evolutionary biology, absorbed its implications with ferocious literalness, and then followed those implications to places their authors had carefully avoided going. By his own account, the process began early. The same years that saw him devouring astronomy texts and writing columns about planetary observation also saw him reading widely in the natural sciences, in ancient history, and in the popular scientific literature that was flooding the English-speaking world at the turn of the 20th century. This was the age of confident materialism. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and by the time Lovecraft was born in 1890, the basic framework of evolutionary biology had reshaped every field it touched. The Earth was old. Life was a process of blind variation and natural selection. Human beings were not the purpose of creation, but one branch of an ancient and indifferent tree. These ideas were not controversial in scientific circles by 1900. They were the settled background against which everything else was being worked out. Lovecraft absorbed this background completely and without reserve. There was no period of doubt, no dramatic crisis of faith, no anguished passage from belief to unbelief, such as we find in the biographies of so many Victorian and Edwardian intellectuals. He simply read the evidence, accepted its implications, and moved on. By his own account, he had abandoned any residual belief in the supernatural by the time he was 12. The universe was matter and force, operating according to discoverable laws, and everything else was wishful thinking. He called himself a mechanistic materialist, a phrase he used repeatedly in his letters, and that describes his position with considerable precision. The universe, as he understood it, was a machine. It operated according to physical laws that admitted no exceptions, no divine interventions, no purposes beyond the interactions of matter and energy. There was no God. There was no soul. There was no cosmic plan. Consciousness itself was an accident, a byproduct of electrochemical processes in a brain that had evolved to help a particular species of primate survive on the African savanna. Every feeling of meaning, purpose, or transcendence that human beings had ever experienced was, in the strictest sense, a local phenomenon with no purchase on the larger reality. He was not the first person to think this way. The philosophical lineage behind his position stretches back more than 2,000 years, and Lovecraft knew it. He had read the ancient atomists, the Greek and Roman thinkers who first proposed that reality consists entirely of atoms moving through empty space. Democritus, who declared that nothing exists except atoms and the void. Epicurus, who built on Democritus's physics a philosophy of modest pleasure and the absence of fear, arguing that if the universe is material and the gods are indifferent, then the proper response is not despair, but a calm enjoyment of the brief life we have. And Lucretius, whose poem De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things, presented the Epicurean worldview with a literary power that Lovecraft genuinely admired. Lucretius wrote about the infinite universe, the mortality of the soul, and the groundlessness of religious fear with a directness that still feels modern. Lovecraft recognized in him a kindred spirit, a man who looked at the cosmos without flinching and reported what he saw. But the ancient atomists, for all their courage, lived before the full implications of their position could be understood. They did not know about deep time. They did not know about galaxies, or the electromagnetic spectrum, or the fossil record, or the second law of thermodynamics. They proposed a universe of infinite atoms in infinite void, but they could not yet measure the actual scale of that infinity. The scientific revolution and its aftermath filled in the picture that Democritus and Lucretius had only sketched, replacing philosophical intuition with measured fact, and each new discovery made the human position smaller. What had been a daring speculation in ancient Athens became, by the early 20th century, an established description of reality supported by converging lines of evidence from physics, chemistry, biology, and astronomy. Lovecraft was acutely aware of this progressive diminishment, and he traced its history in his letters with a precision that reveals how carefully he had thought it through. Copernicus had removed the Earth from the centre of the solar system. Galileo had shown that the heavens were not perfect and unchanging, but turbulent and material. Newton had demonstrated that the same physical laws governed the motion of an apple and the orbit of a planet, collapsing the ancient distinction between the terrestrial and the celestial. Darwin had placed human beings inside nature rather than above it, and the new astronomy of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the astronomy that Lovecraft followed with passionate attention, was revealing a universe so large that the human mind could not meaningfully comprehend it. Each step in this progression had stripped away another layer of the comfortable fiction that the cosmos existed for us. Among the modern thinkers who influenced Lovecraft most directly, and whose works he discussed in his letters, with the kind of specific, engaged commentary that reveals genuine intellectual absorption rather than casual name-dropping, two deserve particular attention. The first was Ernst Haeckel, a German biologist and philosopher whose book, The Riddle of the Universe, published in 1899, attempted a grand synthesis of scientific knowledge into a unified materialist worldview. Haeckel was a monist. He believed that mind and matter were two aspects of a single substance, that there was no soul independent of the body, and that the universe could be understood entirely through the methods of natural science. His book was enormously popular, translated into dozens of languages, and widely discussed in the educated circles that Lovecraft moved through, even if those circles were, in his case, largely composed of books rather than people. Haeckel's confident declaration that science had solved, or would solve, every genuine question about reality gave Lovecraft a framework. But it was a framework he would push far beyond what Haeckel intended. Haeckel was, at bottom, an optimist. He believed that understanding the universe through science was a source of wonder and fulfillment. Lovecraft drew the opposite conclusion. Understanding the universe through science was a source of dread. The second was Hugh Elliot, a British writer whose Modern Science and Materialism, published in 1919, presented a rigorous case for the materialist position. Elliot argued that consciousness, free will, and the apparent purposefulness of life could all be explained as products of physical processes operating according to deterministic laws. Nothing existed outside the material world. Lovecraft read Elliot with enthusiasm and cited him in letters as a decisive influence. What he found in Elliot was not a new idea, but a particularly unflinching statement of the idea he had already been developing on his own, that the universe is a mechanism, that human beings are part of that mechanism, and that the feelings of significance we attach to our existence are projections onto an indifferent reality. Schopenhauer entered the picture from a different angle. Arthur Schopenhauer, the great German pessimist, had argued in The World as Will and Representation that the fundamental nature of reality is a blind, purposeless striving he called the will. The will drives all of nature, from the growth of plants to the ambitions of empires, but it strives toward nothing. It has no goal, no direction, no meaning. Suffering is the default condition of all conscious life, because consciousness exists only to serve the will's purposeless demands. Schopenhauer's pessimism resonated with Lovecraft's own developing sense that existence was, at bottom, a problem without a solution. But Lovecraft never fully adopted Schopenhauer's metaphysics. The will, as Schopenhauer described it, was still a cosmic principle, something that organized reality even if it organized it cruelly. Lovecraft's cosmos had no organizing principle at all. It was not cruel. Cruelty requires intention. It was simply there, and human beings were simply irrelevant to it. Nietzsche, whom Lovecraft also read, presented a different kind of challenge. Nietzsche had declared God dead and had attempted to build a new system of values on the ruins of the old one. The Übermensch, the will to power, the eternal recurrence. These were Nietzsche's answers to the void left by the collapse of Christian metaphysics. Lovecraft admired Nietzsche's courage in facing the implications of a godless universe. He recognized in Nietzsche a thinker who refused to look away from uncomfortable truths, who insisted that honest confrontation with reality was preferable to comfortable illusion. But he rejected the conclusions. The idea that a human being could, through sheer force of will, create meaning in a meaningless cosmos struck Lovecraft as a kind of noble delusion. It was still anthropocentrism, still the insistence that the human perspective mattered, dressed up in more muscular clothing. Nietzsche had killed God only to put humanity on the empty throne. Lovecraft wanted to leave the throne empty. The universe does not care about your will to power. It does not know that you have a will at all. What is striking about all of these encounters is the consistency of Lovecraft's response. Wherever he found a thinker who had glimpsed the indifference of the cosmos and then tried to rescue human significance from the wreckage, Lovecraft noted the glimpse and rejected the rescue. He was not interested in consolation. He was not looking for a philosophical system that would make materialism feel comfortable. He was looking for the truth, and the truth as he understood it was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. The discomfort was the point. A philosophy that makes you feel better about your place in the universe has already failed as a description of reality, because reality does not care whether you feel better about it or not. This is the point at which Lovecraft's position becomes genuinely distinctive. Many thinkers before him had denied God. Many had embraced materialism. Many had argued that the universe operates according to impersonal laws with no regard for human wishes. But most of them had found a way to make this vision livable. The Epicureans counselled gentle pleasure. The Stoics counselled acceptance and virtue. Nietzsche counselled self-overcoming. Even Schopenhauer offered aesthetic contemplation and ascetic renunciation as partial escapes from the will's tyranny. Lovecraft offered nothing, or rather, what he offered was the unflinching recognition that there is nothing to offer. The universe is a mechanism. Human beings are an accident within that mechanism. Our categories of meaning, purpose, value, and significance are local inventions that apply only to ourselves and only for as long as we happen to exist. When we are gone, which on a cosmic timescale will be very soon, the mechanism will continue without noticing our absence. In a letter to Farnsworth Wright, the editor of Weird Tales magazine, written in July of 1927, Lovecraft stated his position with characteristic directness. All of his tales, he explained, were based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. This single sentence is as close to a philosophical manifesto as Lovecraft ever wrote. It does not say that human laws and emotions are illusions exactly. It says something more precise and more unsettling. It says they have no validity beyond the human sphere. They are real to us. They matter to us. But the cosmos at large, the actual universe in which we exist, does not recognize them and is not governed by them. The implications of this position are severe, and Lovecraft knew it. If human values have no cosmic validity, then no human achievement, no matter how grand, has any significance beyond the species that produced it. Civilization is not a step toward anything. It is a local phenomenon, impressive by local standards, invisible from any distance. The great works of art, science, and philosophy that human beings have produced over the past several thousand years are, from a cosmic perspective, as temporary and as meaningless as the nest building of a particular colony of ants. This is not a comforting thought. It is not meant to be. But Lovecraft was not paralyzed by it. He continued to read, to write, to correspond, to take his night walks through Providence, to care deeply about architecture and history and the proper use of the English language. He was a man who believed that nothing matters on a cosmic scale, and who nevertheless poured thousands of hours into things that mattered to him on a human scale. There is a tension in this, a productive tension that runs through everything he wrote. The question of how to live when you believe that life is cosmically insignificant is the question that animates his fiction. He did not try to resolve it with a philosophical system. He tried to express it through stories that make the reader feel what it is like to stand at the edge of that abyss. The stories were his answer, and they were the only answer he considered honest. The most famous sentence Lovecraft ever wrote appears in the opening paragraph of The Call of Cthulhu, the story that would eventually give its name to an entire mythology. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sentence is so frequently quoted that it has become a kind of shorthand for Lovecraft's entire philosophy, reproduced on posters and in anthologies and in countless introductions to his work. But its familiarity can obscure what it is actually saying, which is something more precise and more disturbing than most readers pause to consider. Notice what Lovecraft calls merciful, not kindness, not love, not any positive condition of the human situation. What he calls merciful is ignorance, the inability to see clearly, the failure of the mind to connect what it knows into a coherent picture of reality. He is saying that if we could see the universe as it actually is, the experience would be intolerable. The fragmentation of our understanding, the way we compartmentalize knowledge into disciplines and specialties and isolated facts that never quite add up to a whole, is not a flaw in human cognition. It is a mercy. The alternative would be a clarity so complete that it would shatter the mind that achieved it. This is the core of Cosmicism. Not a doctrine to be believed, not a program to be followed, not even, in the strict sense, an argument to be evaluated. It is a recognition, a way of seeing the cosmos that, once achieved, cannot be fully undone. It is not a formal philosophical system in the way that Kant's critical philosophy or Hegel's dialectic is a system. Lovecraft never wrote a treatise. He never defined his terms with academic precision or constructed arguments in the manner of professional philosophers. What he produced instead was a vision, expressed through fiction and elaborated in thousands of pages of personal correspondence, of the human situation in a universe that is not hostile, not evil, not meaningfully engaged with humanity in any way. The universe is indifferent. It operates according to principles that have no connection to human categories of meaning, purpose, value, or moral order. The stars are not cruel. Cruelty is a human concept requiring intention and awareness. The stars simply burn, and when they are done burning, they go dark, and neither the burning nor the darkness has anything to do with the creatures who once looked up at them and imagined they were signs. This claim, stated baldly, can sound like nihilism, and Lovecraft is often described as a nihilist, but the label is imprecise. Classical nihilism, particularly in its Nietzschean form, holds that nothing has value, that all beliefs are groundless, and that the recognition of this groundlessness creates a crisis from which new values might be forged. Lovecraft is not saying that nothing has value. He is saying something more specific and in some ways more radical. Human values are real within the human sphere. They matter to us because we are the kind of creatures we are. Love, justice, beauty, courage. These are genuine features of human experience. They are not illusions, but they are local. They apply to human beings in the way that the social behavior of a particular species of ant applies to that species of ant. From any perspective beyond the human, they simply do not register. The distinction is important because it changes what follows. If nothing has value, then the appropriate response might be despair or defiance or the creation of new values through an act of will. These are the responses that existentialism, in its various forms, has proposed. Camus said we must imagine Sisyphus happy. Sartre said we are condemned to be free. Nietzsche said we must become who we are. Each of these responses assumes that the human confrontation with meaninglessness is the central drama of existence, that the absence of cosmic meaning creates a space in which human meaning-making becomes heroic, even sacred. Lovecraft would have found all of this touching and beside the point. The human confrontation with meaninglessness is not the central drama of existence. It is not a drama at all. It is one species' private difficulty occurring on one planet for a cosmically negligible period of time. The universe does not watch us struggle with meaning the way a spectator watches a play. It does not watch us at all. This is not a challenge to be overcome. It is not a condition to be transcended. It is simply the way things are, as plainly factual as the distance between stars, and the only honest thing to do is to acknowledge it without pretending otherwise. Lovecraft is not offering a response. He is offering a description. And the description, precisely because it is not framed as a problem requiring a solution, leaves the reader with nowhere to stand. There is a loneliness in this position that is unlike any other philosophical loneliness. The existentialist is alone in a meaningless world, but the world is at least scaled to the existentialist. It is a human-sized world, a world of choices and commitments and relationships with other people who are also struggling to find or create meaning. The cosmicist is alone in a way that makes the existentialist's loneliness look like a minor domestic inconvenience. The cosmicist is alone the way a single bacterium is alone on the floor of the Pacific Ocean. The loneliness is not emotional. It is structural. It is built into the situation. Consider what this meant concretely, not as an abstract proposition, but as a lived experience for a man in Providence in the 1920s. Lovecraft was writing during a period of rapid scientific advancement. Einstein's theories of relativity had revealed that space and time were not fixed and absolute but flexible, warped by mass and energy, behaving in ways that contradicted every intuition human beings had developed over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution. Quantum mechanics was beginning to suggest that at the smallest scales, reality did not behave like anything at all, that particles could exist in multiple states simultaneously. That observation itself altered what was being observed. The new astronomy was pushing the boundaries of the known universe further and further out, past the Milky Way to other galaxies, each containing billions of stars, separated by distances that made the entire history of human civilization look like a footnote written in letters too small to read. Lovecraft followed these developments with the attention of someone who understood their philosophical implications. In his letters from this period, he discussed relativity and the expanding universe with a facility that reveals extensive reading, even if his understanding was necessarily that of an informed layperson rather than a practitioner. He subscribed to scientific journals and read popular accounts of the new physics with the same intensity he brought to his literary interests. He was not a scientist. He had no formal training and no capacity for mathematics beyond a basic level, but he grasped, with an intuitive clarity that many professional scientists avoided, what the new picture of reality implied for the human sense of significance. The scientists themselves often drew back from the implications. They discovered that the universe was unimaginably vast and old, and then they went home to their families and lived as though this knowledge had no bearing on the question of whether human life meant anything. Lovecraft refused that compartmentalization. If the universe is what science says it is, then we are what that universe implies we are. Temporary arrangements of matter, briefly aware, on a world that will one day be swallowed by its own sun. If the universe is billions of years old and billions of light years across, and if human beings have existed for a few 100,000 years on a single planet in one corner of one galaxy, then every claim we make about cosmic purpose or divine intention is, at best, a projection. We are not at the center of anything. We are not the point of anything. We are a local event, briefly conscious, and the universe that produced us has no more investment in our continuation than it has in the continuation of any other chemical reaction. What makes this position genuinely unsettling, and what distinguishes it from the cheerful materialism of thinkers like Haeckel or the defiant atheism of thinkers like Nietzsche, is Lovecraft's insistence that the encounter with cosmic reality is not empowering but destructive. Other materialists had treated the recognition of humanity's smallness as a kind of liberation. If there is no God watching and judging, then we are free. If there is no cosmic purpose, then we can make our own. Lovecraft rejected this entirely. Freedom is a human concept. Making our own purpose is a human project. And the cosmos does not recognize human concepts or human projects. The experience of genuinely confronting the indifference of the universe is not liberating. It is annihilating. It does not free the mind. It breaks it. This is the engine that drives every story he wrote. His narrators do not encounter evil. Evil would be almost reassuring, because evil implies a moral universe in which good and evil are real forces. What his narrators encounter is something worse than evil. Reality without human meaning. A creature sleeping in a sunken city that is older than the human species. A colour that falls from the sky and drains the life from everything it touches, not out of malice, but because that is simply what it does. A mountain range in Antarctica that contains evidence that humanity was an afterthought, a mistake, an accidental byproduct of beings whose concerns were as remote from ours as ours are from the concerns of bacteria. In each case, the horror is not that the universe is hostile. The horror is that it is going about its business, and its business has nothing to do with us. It is worth pausing here to note what Cosmicism is not, because the misreadings are common and consequential. It is not Satanism or anti-theism. Lovecraft was not rebelling against God. Rebellion requires a God to rebel against, and Lovecraft simply found the concept irrelevant. It is not nihilism in the popular sense, the sense in which people use the word to mean that nothing matters and therefore anything is permitted. Things matter to human beings. Love matters. Suffering matters. The question is whether they matter to anything beyond the beings who experience them. Lovecraft's answer was no, and he delivered that answer without either celebrating or mourning it. It is not pessimism exactly, though it shares territory with the pessimistic tradition. A pessimist says, the world is bad. Lovecraft says the world is not anything in moral terms. It is not good or bad. It is not for us or against us. It is simply not about us. There is a passage in Lovecraft's letters, written to a correspondent in 1929, that puts the matter as clearly as anything he ever wrote. He described his fundamental conviction that the world is a meaningless assemblage of matter and force, that human experience is essentially without significance in the larger scheme, and that the most profound truths are those that reveal the utter emptiness of all human pretensions to cosmic importance. He did not write this in anguish. He wrote it in the same measured, analytical tone he used to discuss architecture or the proper pronunciation of English place names. The indifference of the universe was not for Lovecraft a source of torment. It was a fact, and he recorded it with the composure of someone recording the temperature or the phase of the moon. This composure is itself part of the philosophy. If the universe is truly indifferent, then anguish about its indifference is just another human projection, another way of making the cosmos about us. But the composure is deceptive. If cosmic indifference were merely an intellectual position, something a person could hold at arm's length and examine dispassionately, then it would be philosophy in the ordinary sense, an argument to be debated, a claim to be tested against competing claims. Lovecraft understood that it was something more than this. The full apprehension of humanity's cosmic insignificance is not an intellectual event, it is an experiential one. It does something to the person who achieves it. It rearranges the interior landscape. It makes certain comforts unavailable and certain horrors newly visible. This is why Lovecraft turned to fiction rather than to philosophical argument. An argument can be refuted, an experience cannot, and the experience Lovecraft wanted to create, the encounter with a reality that does not acknowledge your categories or respect your boundaries, required a literary form capable of producing that experience in the reader. He found that form in the weird tale, a form he had been practicing and refining for years. Not the ghost story, which operates within a moral universe where the dead return because something is unfinished or unjust. Not the horror story in the conventional sense, which frightens by threatening the body or violating social taboos. The weird tale does something different. It presents the reader with something that should not exist, something that violates not the laws of society, but the laws of the mind, the basic categories through which human beings organize their experience of reality. The weird is not frightening because it threatens us. It is frightening because it suggests that the framework within which threat and safety, meaning and meaninglessness, even existence and non-existence are defined might itself be inadequate. This is philosophy operating at the level of the nervous system. And it is to this form and to the philosophical work it does that we now turn. In 1927, Lovecraft published an essay that reads, in retrospect, like a manifesto. Supernatural horror in literature is ostensibly a survey of the horror tradition from the Gothic novels of the 18th century through the work of his contemporaries. It discusses Anne Radcliffe and Charles Brockden Brown, Edgar Allan Poe and Ambrose Bierce, Arthur Machen and Algernon Blackwood, M.R. James and Lord Dunsany. It is thorough, opinionated and occasionally unfair in its judgments. But its significance lies not in the survey itself, but in the opening declaration that frames the entire enterprise. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. This sentence has been quoted nearly as often as the opening of The Call of Cthulhu, printed on bookmarks and tote bags, cited in academic papers and popular articles, repeated so often that it has acquired the comfortable familiarity of a proverb. And like that opening, its familiarity can disguise its radicalism. Lovecraft is not making a psychological observation. He is making a philosophical one. He is claiming that the most fundamental relationship between human consciousness and the universe is one of fear, and that this fear is not incidental but structural. It is not a response to specific dangers, the way fear of a predator is a response. It is a response to the condition of being a limited consciousness in an unlimited cosmos. We are afraid of the unknown because the unknown is most of reality, and some part of us, the oldest and deepest part, has always understood this. The essay goes on to describe the specific literary form in which this fear finds its purest expression. Lovecraft called it the weird tale, a term he used with deliberate precision to mark off the territory he cared about from the broader landscape of horror, fantasy, and supernatural fiction. He distinguished it carefully from adjacent forms. The conventional ghost story, as he saw it, operates within a moral framework. The ghost returns because something is unresolved, an injustice, a broken promise, a secret that demands exposure. The resolution of the ghost story restores moral order. The detective story, which shares with horror fiction a structure of investigation and revelation, operates within a rational framework. The mystery is solved. The criminal is identified. The world makes sense again. The weird tale does neither. It does not restore moral order because it denies that moral order extends beyond the human sphere. It does not restore rational comprehension because it presents phenomena that exceed the capacity of human reason to process. The weird tale leaves the reader standing at the edge of something that cannot be integrated into any existing framework of understanding. It opens a gap in the mind, a fissure in the comfortable certainty that we know what kind of world we live in, and it does not close it. This is why Lovecraft wrote fiction rather than philosophy. A philosophical argument, however rigorous, operates within the boundaries of rational discourse. It presents premises, develops them logically, and arrives at conclusions that the reader can evaluate, accept, reject, or modify. The experience of reading a philosophical argument is an intellectual one. You may be persuaded, or you may not, but either way, you remain in possession of your faculties. The weird tale works differently. It does not ask you to evaluate a claim. It asks you to inhabit an experience, and the experience in question, the encounter with something that your cognitive apparatus cannot process, is precisely the experience that Cosmicism describes as the fundamental human situation. Lovecraft understood this. He understood it not as a literary theorist, but as a practitioner, someone who had spent years trying to produce a specific effect in the reader and who had developed through that practice an intuition about what worked and what did not. His fiction is not an illustration of a pre-existing philosophy. It is the philosophy itself, conducted through narrative rather than argument, and it achieves things that argument cannot. Consider what happens in a typical Lovecraft story. A narrator, usually an educated, rational man, a scholar or a scientist or an antiquarian, encounters evidence that something exists beyond the range of normal experience. The evidence is fragmentary at first, as it always is. A strange document found among a dead relative's papers. An unusual geological formation that does not appear on any map. A local legend that the narrator initially dismisses as superstition, the kind of thing educated people smile at and move past. But the evidence accumulates, and as it does, the narrator's confidence in the rational order of things begins to erode. The moment of full revelation, when the narrator finally sees or understands what has been lurking at the edges of his investigation, is not a moment of triumph. It is a moment of collapse. The narrator does not conquer the unknown. The unknown conquers the narrator. And the reader, if the story has done its work, does not merely observe this collapse from a safe critical distance. The reader participates in it. For a few minutes or an hour, the reader's own sense of the rational order of things is suspended, and something colder and stranger takes its place. This is philosophy conducted through aesthetic experience. It is not unique to Lovecraft. The existentialists of the mid-20th century used fiction for similar purposes, though with very different aims. Albert Camus published The Stranger in 1942, a novel in which the narrator's flat, affectless voice enacts the experience of living in a world drained of transcendent meaning. The reader does not merely learn about absurdity from Camus. The reader feels it in the prose itself, in the blank declarative sentences, in the narrator's refusal to assign emotional weight to events that conventional fiction would treat as momentous. Jean-Paul Sartre's Nausea, published in 1938, uses the diary form to create the sensation of a consciousness becoming aware that the objects around it are radically contingent, that nothing has to be the way it is, that existence itself is gratuitous. In both cases, the fiction does philosophical work that argument alone cannot. It makes the reader experience, rather than merely understand, a particular relationship to reality. Lovecraft's method differs from the existentialists in a crucial respect. Camus and Sartre are interested in the individual's confrontation with meaninglessness. Their protagonists are human beings trying to live in a world where God is absent and meaning is not given. The drama is human. The scale is human. The question is, how should a person live in the face of absurdity? Lovecraft is not interested in this question, or rather, he regards it as a question asked from inside a bubble of assumptions that his fiction is designed to puncture. The existentialist stands at the center of a meaningless universe and asks what to do. Lovecraft removes the center. In his fiction, the universe is not meaningless in the sense that it fails to provide meaning for human beings. It is meaningful on its own terms, operating according to principles and containing entities that are utterly real, utterly powerful, and utterly unrelated to human concerns. The problem is not that there is no meaning. The problem is that there is meaning everywhere, cosmic meaning, geological meaning, biological meaning, on timescales that dwarf human history, and none of it has anything to do with us. This shift in perspective is the distinctive contribution of the weird tale as Lovecraft practiced it. The existentialist strips away the false comfort of cosmic meaning and leaves the individual alone with their freedom. Lovecraft strips away the false comfort of human centrality and leaves the individual surrounded by meaning they cannot access, comprehend, or integrate. The first is alienation. The second is something for which we do not have a good philosophical term, though Lovecraft's fiction provides the best experiential description of it available in English. One might call it displacement, but displacement implies a home to return to. Lovecraft's characters discover that there is no home, that there never was, that the sense of belonging to a universe built for human habitation was always an illusion produced by the narrowness of human perception. Widen the lens even slightly, and the illusion dissolves. The existentialists wrote philosophical novels. Lovecraft wrote philosophical nightmares. Both approaches use fiction to produce experiences that philosophy alone cannot. But the nightmares go to places the novels will not. They go past the human, past the question of what an individual should do in an absurd world, and into the territory of what happens to an individual who discovers that the world is not merely absurd, but genuinely alien. His essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, lays out the technical requirements for producing this experience with considerable specificity. The weird tale depends, he argued, on atmosphere above all else. The accumulation of dread, the slow displacement of the familiar by the strange, the sense that the rules governing ordinary reality are being quietly suspended, these are the tools that make the weird tale work. A story that relies on shock or surprise may startle the reader, but it does not produce the sustained alteration of consciousness that Lovecraft was after. He wanted something more lasting and more disturbing, the feeling that the floor of reality has shifted beneath you, and that what lies underneath is something your mind was not designed to apprehend. He admired the writers who had achieved this effect before him, and his essay discusses them with the enthusiasm of someone who has found kindred spirits across decades and national boundaries. Arthur Machen, the Welsh author whose The Great God Pan and The White People depicted encounters with a pagan supernatural that was not evil in any Christian sense, but simply alien, operating according to its own logic in a dimension adjacent to the human world. Machen understood that the deepest horror lies not in violence or transgression, but in the revelation that reality has layers the human mind was not built to perceive. Algernon Blackwood, whose stories The Willows and The Wendigo use the natural landscape as a gateway to experiences that dissolve the boundary between the human self and something vast and inhuman. Blackwood's protagonists are not attacked by monsters. They are absorbed by environments, swallowed by a nature that turns out to be far more conscious and far less friendly than anyone assumed. Lord Dunsany, whose fantasies created entire worlds that operated outside the categories of human morality and physics, worlds that did not need to explain themselves to the reader because they were not built for the reader's comprehension. In each of these writers, Lovecraft found a practice of philosophical fiction that aligned with his own instincts. They were not arguing for cosmic indifference. They were creating the experience of it, using narrative and atmosphere to bring the reader to the edge of an abyss that argument alone could not reveal. What Lovecraft added to this tradition was a specifically modern context. Machen's horrors were mythological, rooted in ancient paganism and the suppressed knowledge of pre-Christian Britain. Blackwood's were natural, emerging from the wilderness as an expression of forces older than human consciousness. Lovecraft's horrors were scientific. They emerged from the implications of astronomy, biology, geology, and physics. They did not violate the laws of nature. They extended those laws to their logical conclusions, conclusions that turned out to be more terrifying than any supernatural threat. The thing that sleeps beneath the Pacific in The Call of Cthulhu is not a demon or a god in the theological sense. It is a being that exists within the natural order, a being that preceded human life by millions of years and that will persist long after humanity is gone. The horror is not that it violates nature. The horror is that it belongs to nature, that nature contains things like this, that the universe in which we live is large enough and old enough and strange enough to produce entities before which our entire civilization is a footnote. This is what makes Lovecraft's fiction philosophical in a way that most horror fiction is not. Most horror fiction, even very good horror fiction, plays on fears that have a human origin and a human resolution. The monster can be killed. The curse can be broken. The haunted house can be escaped. The boundary between the safe world and the threatening world is crossed. The threat is confronted and the boundary is restored. Order returns. The reader closes the book and goes to sleep knowing that the walls of reality are intact. Lovecraft's fiction offers no such reassurance. It offers no resolution because the source of its horror is not a monster but a condition. The condition is our actual position in the cosmos, small, temporary, cognitively limited, surrounded by a reality that exceeds our capacity to understand it. You cannot kill a condition. You cannot break it. You can only confront it. And the confrontation, if it is honest, changes you in ways that cannot be undone. This is the philosophical work of the weird tale. It does not tell you about the abyss. It takes you to the edge and lets you look down. In the summer of 1926, Lovecraft sat in his apartment at 169 Clinton Street in Brooklyn, New York, and wrote the story that would define him. He was living in the city he hated most in the world. He had married Sonia Green in 1924 and moved to New York at her insistence, and the experience was, by his own account, one of sustained misery. The crowds, the noise, the the sheer crushing density of human life in a place that bore no resemblance to the quiet colonial streets of Providence, all of it pressed on him with a weight that his letters from this period describe in terms approaching genuine desperation. He and Sonia had separated. He was living alone in a small apartment in the Red Hook neighborhood of Brooklyn, barely surviving on the meager income from his revision work and his occasional sales to the pulp magazines. He was 35 years old and had accomplished nothing that the world recognized as significant. He was, by any conventional measure, a failure. It was in this state of displacement and unhappiness, at the lowest point of his adult life, living in a city that seemed to confirm every fear he had ever harbored about the chaos of the modern world, that he produced The Call of Cthulhu, the single most important work of philosophical horror fiction in the 20th century. The circumstances of its composition are worth remembering, because great works of art often emerge not from comfort and stability, but from crisis, from the precise point where a mind under pressure finds the form adequate to its distress. The story is structured as an investigation conducted by a young man named Francis Wayland Thurston after the death of his granduncle, Professor George Gammell Angel of Brown University. Thurston discovers among his uncle's papers a collection of documents, clippings, and notes that together reveal a pattern too large for any single mind to have perceived. The pattern centers on a figure called Cthulhu, a being of immense antiquity and power that lies sleeping in a sunken city beneath the Pacific Ocean. Cthulhu is worshipped by scattered cults across the globe, its existence known only to those on the margins of civilization. Artists driven mad by dreams, isolated peoples who have preserved traditions dating back thousands of years, and the occasional scholar who stumbles across evidence that cannot be explained within the existing framework of human knowledge. The narrative unfolds in 3 sections, each peeling back a layer of the reality that normal life conceals. The first section introduces the mystery through Professor Angel's notes on a young sculptor, Henry Wilcox, who has been producing disturbing artwork under the influence of dreams he cannot explain. The second section describes the account of a police inspector in New Orleans who raided a cult meeting in the swamps of Louisiana and discovered rituals devoted to a being whose description matches the images in Wilcox's dreams. The third section provides the testimony of a Norwegian sailor, Gustaf Johansen, who encountered the risen city of Orlie during a voyage in the South Pacific, and who survived, barely and temporarily, a direct encounter with Cthulhu itself. The philosophical architecture of this 3-part structure deserves careful attention, because it is not merely a narrative device, but a demonstration of how cosmic knowledge works. Each section moves further from the safety of civilized rational life and closer to the reality that civilization exists to deny. Thurston begins as a scholar sitting in a library, reading his uncle's papers. He ends in a state of existential terror, having assembled a picture of reality so disturbing that he expects to be killed for possessing it. The movement of the story is not from ignorance to knowledge in the triumphant sense that Western culture usually celebrates. It is from comfortable ignorance to unbearable knowledge, and the knowledge in question is not a specific fact, but a condition. The condition of knowing that human civilization is not the dominant force on this planet, that something older and more powerful exists beneath the surface of the world we have built, and that its awakening would render everything we have ever accomplished meaningless. One of the story's most effective philosophical techniques is this layering of narration. We never encounter Cthulhu directly. We read Thurston's account of his uncle's notes about Wilcox's dreams about Cthulhu. We read Thurston's account of a police inspector's account of a cult that worships Cthulhu. We read Thurston's account of a dead sailor's testimony about seeing Cthulhu. Each layer of mediation increases the distance between the reader and the event, and yet the effect is not to diminish the event but to amplify it. The very fact that we can only approach this knowledge indirectly, through fragments and intermediaries and reconstructed accounts, mirrors the philosophical claim at the heart of the story, that the truth about reality is not something human beings can confront directly. We can only catch glimpses, assemble partial pictures, and infer the shape of something too large to see whole. Cthulhu itself is not a monster in the conventional sense. It is a philosophical proposition given narrative form. What if there existed a being so old that human history, all of it, the rise and fall of every empire, every religion, every system of thought, was a single moment in its sleep? What if that being was not evil, not hostile, not engaged with humanity in any way, but simply present, occupying a reality so far beyond our comprehension that our encounter with it would destroy our minds not through any malicious intent, but through the sheer incompatibility of its nature with our cognitive apparatus? This is what Cthulhu represents. It is the cosmos made flesh, the indifference of the universe given a shape that the human imagination can almost but not quite grasp. The horror of the Call of Cthulhu is not that Cthulhu might destroy civilization. It is that civilization, in the face of what Cthulhu represents, was never anything more than a fragile local arrangement maintained by the accident of our ignorance. Nearly a decade before the Call of Cthulhu, in 1917, Lovecraft had written the story that contains the first clear articulation of this vision. If the Call of Cthulhu is Cosmicism at its most architecturally ambitious, Dagon is Cosmicism stripped to its essentials, raw, compressed, almost frantic in its urgency. The narrator is a Marine officer whose ship is captured by a German raider during the First World War. He escapes in a small boat and drifts for days until he finds himself stranded on a vast expanse of ocean floor that has risen above the surface, exposing a landscape of black, slimy mud that stretches to the horizon in every direction. The stench is overpowering, a reek of decaying marine life exposed for the first time in geological ages. The terrain is alien, a landscape that no human being was meant to see. As the narrator walks across this nightmare landscape, he discovers a monolith covered in carvings that depict beings of enormous size, vaguely humanoid, moving through an underwater world that predates anything in the human record. Then the narrator sees it, a vast, Polyphemus-like shape rising from the water beside the monolith, a living thing of enormous size, an alien anatomy that belongs to the same world as the carved figures on the stone. The creature is real. The civilization that produced the monolith is real. And the narrator, alone on this risen plain of sea mud in the middle of the Pacific, standing before evidence that everything he understood about the history of life on Earth is wrong, feels his mind begin to give way. The encounter drives him to the edge of sanity. The story ends with him in a rented room, addicted to morphine, writing his account before the thing he has seen catches up with him. Dagon is crude in places, its effects sometimes more theatrical than atmospheric. But the philosophical core is already complete. The narrator has encountered evidence of a civilization that existed before humanity, and that was produced by beings who dwarf us in every sense. His response is not heroism or even comprehension. It is collapse. The knowledge is too large for the container of a human mind. Between Dagon and the Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft wrote a story that operates in an entirely different register but arrives at a closely related philosophical conclusion. The music of Eric Zahn, written in 1921, is one of his most restrained and effective works. The narrator, a university student, rents a cheap room in a building on a street called the Rue d'Orsay, a street that he can never afterward find on any map. Above him lives an old German man named Eric Zahn, a mute who plays the viol in a local theatre orchestra. At night, after the performances, Zahn returns to his room and plays music of extraordinary strangeness and intensity, music unlike anything the narrator has heard before. The narrator, drawn by the strangeness and intensity of the music, befriends Zan and eventually learns, or rather intuits, the truth. Zan's room has a high window that opens onto something, not a street, not a courtyard, something else, something that the narrator glimpses only once, in a moment of terrifying revelation. Zan plays his wild, unearthly music not for pleasure or art, but as a defense, a barrier, a wall of sound erected nightly against whatever exists on the other side of that window. When the barrier fails, when the wind tears the music from Zan's hands and the window bursts open, what the narrator sees through the opening is not a cityscape, but a void. A blackness full of movement and sound, and the suggestion of immensities beyond calculation. This story is among the most philosophically suggestive things Lovecraft ever wrote, and it is worth dwelling on what it means. Zan is an artist, but his art is not expression. It is not the outpouring of an inner life into form. It is protection. It is a barrier. He plays to keep something out, and what he is keeping out is the cosmos itself, the reality that presses against the thin membrane of human experience. We might read this as Lovecraft's most intimate reflection on what art, including his own art, is actually doing. Every story, every painting, every piece of music is, in some sense, a wall built against the void. It shapes experience into patterns that the mind can hold. It creates the illusion of order, meaning, narrative coherence, and it works most of the time. But the void does not go away because we have built walls against it. It waits. The music is beautiful and desperate in equal measure. It is the sound of a human being using the only tool available to him to hold back a truth that would destroy him if it got through. And it does get through. The window opens. The void enters. Zan dies. The narrator flees. The street disappears from every map, as though reality itself has sealed over the wound. What these three stories share, beneath their considerable differences in structure and tone, is a single philosophical argument expressed in three variations. Human beings live within a constructed reality, a framework of assumptions, categories, and institutions that makes the world seem comprehensible and manageable. This framework is not false exactly. It works. It allows us to build cities, write laws, produce art, conduct science, and maintain the belief that our existence has significance. It is, in fact, remarkably effective, so effective that we mistake it for reality itself. We forget that it is a construction. We forget that it covers only a tiny fraction of what actually exists. We take the map for the territory and are startled when the territory turns out to be immeasurably larger, stranger, and more populated than the map suggested. But the framework is local. It applies only within the narrow band of experience that human cognition can process. Beyond that band, beyond the edge of the map, the ocean floor, or the window in Eric Zan's room, lies something that the framework cannot contain. The encounter with that something is not an adventure. It is a disaster. Not because the something is hostile, but because the framework, upon contact with what lies beyond it, reveals itself as what it always was. A thin, desperate, beautiful construction raised against an indifference so vast that the word indifference barely begins to describe it. The sailor Johansen, having looked upon the risen city of R'lyeh and the stirring form of Cthulhu, does not return as a wiser man. He returns shattered, dying within a year, his testimony dismissed as the ravings of a mind destroyed by fever and exposure. The narrator of Dagon ends his life in a rented room, waiting for the thing from the sea to find him. Eric Zan dies with his viol in his hands, the music that protected him scattered by a wind from beyond the world. These are not failures of courage. They are encounters with something for which no amount of courage is adequate. Bravery is a human virtue designed for human-scale threats. It has no application to the cosmically alien. The universe does not reward those who seek it. It does not punish them either. It simply breaks them open and lets the light pour out. By the early 1930s, Lovecraft had returned to Providence and entered the most productive phase of his creative life. The New York years were behind him. His marriage to Sonia Green had effectively ended, though the legal divorce would not come until 1929. He was living in modest rooms, first at 10 Barnes Street and later at 66 College Street, both in the East Side neighborhood he loved. He was poor, sustained by a modest inherited income that shrank each year and the meagre payments from his revision work and occasional fiction sales to the pulp magazines. But he was writing with a clarity and ambition that his earlier work had only promised. The 3 stories he produced in this period represent the fullest development of his philosophical vision, each one approaching the problem of cosmic indifference from a different angle. At the Mountains of Madness, written in 1931 and published with reluctance by Astounding Stories in 1936 after Weird Tales rejected it, is Lovecraft's longest and most sustained work of fiction. It is also his most explicitly philosophical. The story takes the form of a scientific report narrated by William Dyer, a geologist at Miskatonic University who has led an expedition to Antarctica. The narrative voice is deliberately measured, almost clinical, as though Dyer is struggling to contain the implications of what he has to report within the controlled language of academic discourse. What the expedition discovers, beyond a previously unknown mountain range of staggering height, is a city. Not a ruin in the ordinary sense, not the remains of a human civilization that flourished and declined, but the remains of a civilization that was never human at all. The builders were beings that the expedition's biologists classify as unknown to any existing taxonomy, creatures of extraordinary complexity and evident intelligence that the narrative refers to as the Elder Things. The city is millions of years old. Its murals, preserved by the Antarctic cold, depict a history that predates not merely human civilization, but the emergence of complex life on Earth as we understand it. This is unsettling enough. But the story's philosophical centre lies in a specific detail of that history, a detail that Dyer pieces together from the murals with increasing horror. The Elder Things did not merely precede humanity, they created it. Or rather, they created the raw biological material from which complex Earth life eventually evolved, including human beings. They did this not as an act of creation in any purposeful sense, not as gods shaping creatures in their image, but as an incidental byproduct of other work. They produced what the story calls shoggoths, protoplasmic servants engineered for labour, and the biological overflow from this engineering, the waste products and escaped experiments, seeded the Earth with the organic material that would eventually, over hundreds of millions of years, produce the fish, the amphibians, the reptiles, the mammals, and finally the primates who would one day call themselves the crown of creation. The philosophical implications of this scenario are devastating, and Lovecraft knew it. If humanity is the accidental byproduct of an alien engineering project, if we are to the Elder Things roughly what mold is to a neglected piece of bread, then every claim we have ever made about human dignity, purpose, or cosmic significance is not merely wrong but absurd. We were not created in the image of God. We were not placed at the top of a great chain of being. We were not even noticed. The beings who inadvertently produced us were themselves, as the murals reveal, eventually overrun by their own creations, the shoggoths, who rebelled against their makers in a catastrophe that reduced the great civilization to ruins. The creators were destroyed by their tools, and the accidental byproducts of their creativity went on to populate the Earth without ever knowing what had happened or who had made them. The structure of At the Mountains of Madness mirrors its philosophical argument. It begins as a sober scientific narrative, full of geological observations and logistical details about the expedition. It moves through a phase of increasing wonder as the explorers discover fossils and structures that defy existing scientific categories. And it arrives, in its final movement, at a revelation so large that the narrative voice itself begins to fracture, the measured academic tone giving way to passages of near incoherence as Dyer struggles to describe what he and his colleague Danforth encountered in the deeper tunnels beneath the city. The form of the story enacts the content. The rational framework works, and then it meets something it cannot contain, and the framework cracks. And yet, in one of the story's most philosophically complex moments, Dyer experiences something unexpected upon studying the murals. He feels pity for the elder things. He recognizes in them, despite their alien anatomy and their inhuman history, beings who built cities, created art, conducted scientific research, and struggled against forces that threatened to destroy them. They were not gods. They were creatures, as mortal and as vulnerable as we are, living in a universe that was as indifferent to their concerns as it is to ours. Dyer calls them men, and the word is startling in context because it collapses the distance between human and alien and reveals that the real horror is not the existence of beings more powerful than us, but the realization that even beings more powerful than us are subject to the same cosmic indifference that governs our own existence. There is no privileged position, not for us and not for anyone. The Colour Out of Space, written in 1927, approaches the alien from a direction so oblique that it almost escapes description. It was Lovecraft's personal favourite among his stories, and it is easy to see why. It is the purest expression of his philosophical vision, the encounter with something so utterly outside human categories that it cannot be perceived, named, or understood. The story is set in the fictional Arkham countryside of Massachusetts, among the rolling hills and old stone walls of a New England landscape that Lovecraft knew intimately from his travels through the rural areas surrounding Providence. A meteorite falls on the farm of Nahum Gardner, a simple, decent man with a wife and sons, a man who asks nothing from the universe except to work his land and raise his family in peace. Scientists from Miskatonic University examine the meteorite and find that it contains a substance that does not correspond to any known element. It has a colour, but the colour is not a colour anyone has seen before. It defies spectroscopic analysis. It does not behave like any material in the scientific record, and then slowly it begins to affect the land around the Gardner farm. The vegetation grows unnaturally lush and then rots. The fruit looks beautiful, but tastes bitter. The animals become strange and then die. The water in the well takes on a peculiar quality, and the Gardner family, one by one, goes mad. The genius of this story is that the thing itself is never explained. It is not a creature with motivations. It is not an invader with a plan. It is simply a phenomenon, something that has arrived from outside the terrestrial order and that operates according to principles that have no analogue in human experience. The colour is the key, a colour that does not exist in the visible spectrum, that cannot be matched to any known wavelength, that the human eye perceives as colour without being able to categorise or remember it. This is Lovecraft's most radical gesture toward the truly alien. He does not give it tentacles or wings or a vaguely anthropoid form. He gives it a quality that the human sensory apparatus can register but not process. It is the experience of perceiving something that your perceptual system was not built to handle. It is the breakdown of the interface between consciousness and reality. The Gardners do not fight the colour. There is nothing to fight. They do not understand it. There is nothing to understand, at least not in human terms. They simply deteriorate, their bodies and minds dissolving under the influence of something that has no interest in them, that is doing whatever it does for reasons. if reasons is even the right word, that have nothing to do with the creatures whose well it has contaminated. The colour drains the life from the farm and eventually rises back into the sky, leaving behind a blasted heath that nothing will grow on, a permanent scar on the landscape that the locals learn to avoid without ever being able to explain what happened there. This is cosmic indifference rendered in its purest form, not a sleeping god, not an alien civilization, not even an entity with a form that could be drawn, or a name that could be spoken, just a phenomenon, a thing that happens, a colour from a place that is not here, following rules that are not ours. The scientific community in the story cannot classify it. The Gardner family cannot resist it. The narrator, telling the story years later, cannot even adequately describe it. Language fails. Taxonomy fails. Perception itself fails. And the thing goes on doing what it does, indifferent to the fact that an entire family died trying to share a world with it. This is perhaps the closest Lovecraft ever came to representing pure cosmicism in fiction, an encounter with something that is not hostile, not comprehensible, not even fully perceptible, but simply and lethally alien. The Shadow over Innsmouth, written in 1931, turns the cosmicist lens inward, where At the Mountains of Madness reveals humanity's insignificance from without, and The Colour Out of Space depicts the alien as utterly incomprehensible. Innsmouth makes the alien personal. It puts it inside the narrator's own body. The story follows Robert Olmsted, a young man on a genealogical tour of New England who visits the decaying port town of Innsmouth. The town is shunned by its neighbours. Its inhabitants have a peculiar appearance: wide, flat faces, bulging eyes, rough greyish skin. The locals call it the Innsmouth look. Olmsted learns through the drunken ramblings of an old man named Zadok Allen that the town's patriarch, Captain Obed Marsh, had made contact with a race of amphibious beings called the Deep Ones in the 19th century. The townspeople intermarried with these creatures. The Innsmouth look is not a genetic quirk. It is the visible sign of hybridization between human and inhuman, a transformation that progresses over the course of a lifetime until the hybrid abandons human form entirely and enters the sea to live among the Deep Ones forever. The horror of the story escalates through one of Lovecraft's most effective sequences of pure narrative terror. Olmsted's nighttime escape from Innsmouth, pursued through the decaying streets by hybrid townspeople whose shambling gait and croaking voices mark them as something less and more than human. But the true horror comes later, when Olmsted discovers, through careful investigation of his own family history, that he is himself of Innsmouth descent. The blood of the Deep Ones runs in his veins. The transformation is coming for him too. The story ends with Olmsted looking into a mirror and beginning to see the changes in his own face, and with a final passage in which he contemplates not resistance, but acceptance, imagining the day when he will swim to the reef off Innsmouth and descend to the underwater city of Yhattnthley to live among his true kin. This is the most philosophically disturbing of the three stories, because it denies the one comfort that the others leave intact. In At the Mountains of Madness, the explorers can fly home and try to forget what they found. In The Colour Out of Space, the blasted heath is a place that can be avoided. In Innsmouth, there is no escape because the alien is not out there. It is in here. It is in the narrator's blood, in his genes, in the shape of his skull. The boundary between human and inhuman, which we treat as absolute and fixed, turns out to be permeable. It can be crossed. It is being crossed slowly in the narrator's own body, and there is nothing he can do to stop it. The philosophical claim embedded in this narrative is that the human is not a stable category. We imagine ourselves as a fixed point, a defined species with clear boundaries, separated from everything else by an uncrossable line. Our religions tell us we are made in God's image. Our philosophies tell us we are the rational animal, distinct in kind from all other life. Even our science, for all its commitment to naturalism, tends to treat Homo sapiens as a finished product, the end point of an evolutionary process rather than a moment in one. Lovecraft dissolves all of these assurances. He suggests that the boundaries are provisional, that the forces that shaped us continue to operate, and that what lies on the other side of the human is not a metaphor but a biological reality waiting to assert itself. The mirror in which Olmsted sees his face changing is the most terrifying image in all of Lovecraft's fiction, because it is the image of cosmicism come home. The universe is not just indifferent to us from a great distance, it is indifferent to us from the inside of our own cells. There is a recurring figure in Lovecraft's fiction, so consistent across dozens of stories that he amounts to a type. He is a scholar, usually a professor, sometimes an antiquarian, occasionally an independent researcher with access to a university library. He is intelligent, educated, and deeply committed to the rational investigation of reality. He reads obscure texts in dead or forgotten languages. He follows evidence wherever it leads, with the quiet confidence of a man who believes that the universe is ultimately intelligible and that the tools of reason, carefully and patiently applied, are adequate to its mysteries. He is, in short, a man very much like Lovecraft himself, and in story after story this man is destroyed, not killed necessarily, though many of Lovecraft's scholars do die, in hospitals and attic rooms and the ruins of places they should never have entered. Destroyed in a more fundamental sense, a sense that is worse than death because it leaves the body intact while hollowing out the mind. Their minds break. Their confidence in rational understanding collapses. They see something, or learn something, or piece together something from the fragments of their research, and the knowledge they acquire does not empower them. It annihilates them. They go mad, or they retreat into silence, or they write frantic testimonies that read like the last dispatches from a consciousness in the process of dissolving. The pattern is so consistent that it might look at first glance like an anti-intellectual stance. Lovecraft seems to be saying that the pursuit of knowledge is dangerous, that some things are better left unknown, that the scholar who digs too deep will pay the price. But this reading is wrong. It misses the philosophical precision of what Lovecraft is doing. He was not anti-intellectual. He revered science. He spent his life reading scientific texts, following scientific debates, and corresponding with scientists and scientifically minded thinkers. His astronomy columns, his enthusiasm for evolutionary biology, his detailed engagement with the physics and chemistry of his era. These are not the habits of a man who mistrusts the rational investigation of reality. Lovecraft loved knowledge. What he doubted was the capacity of the human mind to absorb certain kinds of knowledge without being shattered by the experience. This is an epistemological claim, not a moral one. Lovecraft is not saying that knowledge is forbidden, as a religious tradition might say. He is not saying that the gods punish those who seek to know too much, as the Greek myth of Prometheus suggests. He is saying something far more unsettling and far more modern, that human cognition has structural limits. The mind evolved to solve specific problems in a specific environment. It developed to track predators, to identify food sources, to navigate social hierarchies, to recognize patterns in a narrow band of experience bounded by the scale of the human body and the span of a human lifetime. It did not evolve to comprehend the age of the universe, the structure of quantum reality, the geometry of higher dimensions, or the existence of entities whose cognitive architecture is as different from ours as ours is from that of a flatworm. When the mind is forced to confront phenomena that fall outside its evolved parameters, it does not expand to accommodate them. It fails. The madness that afflicts Lovecraft's characters is not a literary convention borrowed from Gothic fiction, where madness functions as a punishment or a plot device. It is a philosophical argument. It is the claim that there are aspects of reality that the human brain is not equipped to process, and that the encounter with those aspects produces not enlightenment, but cognitive breakdown. The mind does not go mad because it has sinned or because it is weak. It goes mad because it is a tool designed for one purpose being applied to another, like using a telescope to examine a bacterium. The instrument is not defective. It is simply being asked to do something it was not built for. There is something almost tender about this. Lovecraft does not condemn his scholars for their curiosity. He does not portray them as reckless or hubristic in the manner of a Faustian cautionary tale. They are careful, methodical, sincere. They follow the evidence. They apply their training. They do everything right, and they are destroyed anyway, not because they did something wrong, but because the universe is built in such a way that doing everything right, if you go far enough, leads to the edge of a cliff. The sympathy Lovecraft extends to his doomed investigators is one of the most overlooked qualities of his fiction. He understands their devotion to knowledge because it was his own devotion. He simply recognizes that devotion to truth and the capacity to survive truth are not the same thing. This idea has philosophical precedent. Immanuel Kant, writing in the late 18th century, drew a fundamental distinction between phenomena, the world as it appears to human consciousness, structured by the mind's inherent categories of space, time, and causality, and noumena, the world as it is in itself, independent of any perceiving mind. Kant argued that human beings can never know the noumenal world directly. We can only know reality as it appears to us, filtered through the cognitive structures that make experience possible. The thing in itself, the Ding and Sich, remains permanently inaccessible. Lovecraft almost certainly read some version of Kant, whether in the original or through secondary summaries, though there is no evidence he studied Kant in depth or engaged with the technical apparatus of the critical philosophy. But his fiction arrives at a Kantian conclusion through a different route. Where Kant argued transcendentally, demonstrating the limits of knowledge through an analysis of the conditions of possible experience, Lovecraft argued narratively, showing what happens when a character encounters the noumenal directly. The result in Lovecraft's fiction is always the same. The character does not return with new understanding. The character returns broken or does not return at all. This is because the noumenal, in Lovecraft's version, is not merely unknowable in principle. It is incompatible with the structures of human consciousness. Encountering it does not produce mystery or wonder in the positive sense. It produces a fundamental disorientation from which recovery is impossible. The categories through which the mind organizes experience, time, space, causality, identity, the distinction between self and world, do not apply to what lies beyond the human perceptual horizon. When the mind is forced to perceive something to which its categories do not apply, the categories collapse, and with them the mind itself. The Necronomicon, Lovecraft's most famous fictional creation after Cthulhu itself, is the literary embodiment of this epistemological claim. The Necronomicon is a book attributed to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred that contains knowledge about the true nature of reality, the entities that inhabit it, the forces that govern it, and the history that preceded human civilization by millions of years. It appears in story after story as the object of scholarly obsession. Professors seek it in university libraries. Researchers track down copies in private collections. Occultists study its pages in search of power or understanding, and everyone who reads it is damaged by the experience. The Necronomicon is not a magical grimoire in the conventional fantasy sense. It does not contain spells that unlock forbidden powers. What it contains is information, a description of reality as it actually is, unfiltered by the merciful limitations of human perception. It is, in essence, the book that tells the truth. And the truth in Lovecraft's cosmos is not something the human mind can safely contain. The Necronomicon drives its readers mad not because the knowledge is cursed, but because the knowledge is accurate. It describes a universe in which human beings are irrelevant, in which entities of incomprehensible power exist according to principles that bear no relation to human logic, and in which the comforting structures of meaning and order that we have built around ourselves are revealed as what they have always been: local constructions with no foundation in the larger reality. This is a remarkable literary invention because it turns the book, the traditional symbol of enlightenment and intellectual progress, into an instrument of destruction. The Western tradition has long celebrated the pursuit of knowledge. The Enlightenment made it the highest human value. The university built its entire institutional structure around the assumption that more knowledge is always better, that the accumulation of understanding leads to progress, freedom, and the improvement of the human condition. Lovecraft does not disagree with this assumption at the human scale. He simply points out that it fails at the cosmic scale. The scholar who reads the Necronomicon is not engaging in forbidden knowledge in the religious sense. He is engaging in accurate knowledge, knowledge that happens to be too large for the human mind. There is no serpent, no tree, no divine prohibition. There is only a mind encountering information that it was not built to contain. The tragedy is not moral, but structural. The mind was designed for a certain range of inputs, and the Necronomicon provides inputs from outside that range. The result is not wisdom, it is ruin. Lovecraft's epistemology also surfaces in his treatment of language and description, a feature of his prose that has drawn both criticism and, more recently, serious philosophical attention. His narrators frequently resort to words like indescribable, unnameable, inconceivable, and incomprehensible. They pile negation upon negation, reaching for what something is by cataloguing everything it is not. Critics have sometimes read this as a failure of literary technique, a lazy reliance on adjectives that tell rather than show, but in context, the technique is philosophically deliberate. When a narrator says that what he saw was indescribable, he is not admitting that Lovecraft lacked the skill to describe it. He is asserting that description itself, which depends on the existence of shared categories between the describer and the audience, has reached its limit. The thing cannot be described because description is a human activity that operates within human categories, and the thing exists outside those categories. Language, which is the most sophisticated tool human beings have developed for organizing and communicating experience, fails when confronted with the genuinely alien. It does not fail because it is imprecise. It fails because it is human. There is a scene in The Whisperer in Darkness, written in 1930, that illustrates this with particular clarity. The narrator, Albert Wilmarth, a professor of literature at Miskatonic University, has been corresponding with a farmer in Vermont named Henry Akeley about evidence of alien beings in the hills. Wilmarth is initially skeptical. He applies the tools of rational analysis, examining the evidence with the care of a trained academic. But as the evidence accumulates, his skepticism erodes, and when he finally visits Akeley's farmhouse, he encounters something that his rational framework cannot process. The revelation at the end of the story, the discovery that Akeley has been replaced by something wearing his face and speaking in his voice, is effective as horror. But it is also effective as epistemology. The signs were there. The evidence was available. A mind operating without the constraints of human assumptions might have seen the truth immediately. Wilmarth's failure is not a failure of intelligence or attention. It is a failure of cognitive architecture. His mind is built to assume that the person sitting in a chair and speaking in a familiar voice is the person he appears to be. When that assumption is violated, the mind does not smoothly adjust to the new reality. It fractures. This is perhaps the most important philosophical contribution of Lovecraft's fiction, the demonstration that the limits of human knowledge are not merely practical, not merely a matter of insufficient data or inadequate instruments, but structural. They are built into the architecture of consciousness itself. We cannot know the universe as it is because we are not the kind of beings that can know the universe as it is. We are the kind of beings that can know a small, local, filtered version of reality, and we mistake that version for the whole. Lovecraft's scholars make this mistake, and they are punished for it. Not by God, not by the universe, not by any moral agency. They are punished by the simple fact that reality is larger than the mind that tries to contain it. The container breaks, the contents spill out, and what is left is not a wiser man, but a ruin, a consciousness that has seen too clearly and can never again pretend that the comfortable limits of the human world are the limits of what exists. This epistemological vision is, in its own way, as important as the ontological vision of cosmic indifference. Cosmicism tells us what the universe is: vast, old, indifferent, populated by forces and entities that have nothing to do with human concerns. But the epistemological dimension tells us something equally disturbing about what we are: cognitive systems with a built-in horizon, evolved for competence in a narrow niche, structurally incapable of grasping the whole of a reality that we are nonetheless part of. We are not merely small, we are limited in our very capacity to understand how small we are. And that limitation, which might seem like a curse, is in fact the only thing that allows us to function at all. Any honest account of Lovecraft's philosophy must confront the fact that the philosopher was a racist. Not a man who harboured the casual, unreflective prejudices common to his era and social class, though he did that too. Lovecraft's racism was active, articulate, and extreme. It is documented in hundreds of letters, expressed with a vehemence and specificity that makes it impossible to dismiss as a product of the times. He held views about racial hierarchy that were severe even by the standards of early 20th century New England, and he expressed those views with the same analytical confidence he brought to his discussions of astronomy and aesthetics. This is not a footnote to his philosophy. It is not a biographical curiosity. It is a problem within the philosophy itself, a failure that illuminates the philosophy precisely by contradicting its deepest claims. The evidence is abundant and unambiguous, preserved in the very letters that also contain his most brilliant philosophical reflections and his most generous literary advice. In his correspondence, Lovecraft described people of African, Jewish, Italian, Portuguese, and Asian descent in terms that ranged from condescending to venomous. During his years in New York, from 1924 to 1926, the period of his greatest personal misery, his letters are particularly savage. The immigrant neighborhoods of the Lower East Side, the diversity of Brooklyn, the sheer heterogeneity of a modern American city, all of this provoked in Lovecraft a visceral revulsion that he made no effort to temper or conceal. He wrote about encountering people of other ethnicities in language that expressed not merely discomfort, but something closer to physical horror. His biographer, S.T. Joshi, who has done more than anyone to establish Lovecraft as a serious literary figure, describes these passages with frank discomfort, noting that they go well beyond the conventional prejudices of the period and into territory that can only be called pathological. The racism also surfaces in his fiction, though less frequently and less explicitly than in his letters. The Horror at Red Hook, written in 1925 during the depths of his New York misery, is the most direct expression. The story depicts the immigrant neighborhoods of Brooklyn as a seething mass of degeneracy, a place where ancient evils thrive in the anonymity and chaos of the modern city, fed by the very diversity that Lovecraft found so threatening in his daily life. The prose is hysterical in a way that Lovecraft's best fiction never is, the horror fueled not by cosmic dread, but by ethnic loathing. It is widely regarded as one of his weakest stories precisely because the racism overwhelms the narrative. The philosophical structure that gives his best work its power, the encounter with something genuinely beyond the human, is absent. What remains is prejudice wearing the costume of cosmic horror. The shadow over Innsmouth, discussed earlier for its philosophical treatment of the permeable boundary between human and inhuman, also carries racial overtones that are difficult to ignore. The Innsmouth look, the physical degeneration of the townspeople through interbreeding with the deep ones, can be read as Lovecraft's anxiety about racial mixing given mythological form. The fear of contaminated bloodlines, of hereditary degradation, of discovering that your own ancestry contains something alien and monstrous. These are simultaneously the philosophical concerns of Cosmicism and the racial anxieties of a man who believed in the superiority of Anglo-Saxon civilization, with a fervour that bordered on obsession. Other stories carry subtler traces. The Rats in the Walls, written in 1923, is a powerful tale of ancestral horror in which the narrator discovers that his family's ancient estate conceals evidence of a monstrous history of subterranean cannibalism stretching back to Roman times. The story is one of Lovecraft's finest, and it works on the level of pure cosmic horror. But the name of the narrator's cat, which Lovecraft chose without apparent irony, is a racial slur so egregious that modern reprints uniformly change it. The detail is small but telling. It reveals how deeply embedded racial consciousness was in Lovecraft's daily thought, surfacing even in moments where no racial content was intended or necessary. This dual reading is precisely what makes the philosophical problem so difficult and so instructive. It is not possible to cleanly separate Lovecraft's cosmic horror from his racial horror. They share a vocabulary. They share a set of images. They share the fundamental gesture of encountering otherness and recoiling from it. The question is whether the cosmic horror is simply the racial horror elevated to a grander scale, or whether the two are genuinely distinct phenomena that happen to share a common emotional register. The first reading, that Lovecraft's cosmic fear is essentially his racial fear writ large, has been argued persuasively by Michel Houellebecq, among others. In H.P. Lovecraft Against the World, Against Life, Houellebecq suggests that Lovecraft's xenophobia and his cosmicism spring from the same source, an overwhelming sense that the world is full of things that are alien, threatening, and impossible to assimilate. The immigrant on the street and the entity in the sunken city produce the same response in Lovecraft, a horror of the other so deep that it shapes his entire perception of reality. On this reading, Cosmicism is not a universal philosophical insight, but a provincial phobia expanded to cosmic dimensions. It is the worldview of a frightened man in a rooming house in Brooklyn, projecting his fear of his neighbours onto the universe itself. This reading has considerable force, and it should not be dismissed. It identifies a genuine connection, a real pattern in Lovecraft's psychology that links his personal fears to his cosmic ones. The chronology supports it. The New York years when Lovecraft's racism was at its most virulent were also the years that produced some of his most important fiction, including The Call of Cthulhu. The emotional texture of these stories, the sense of an ordered world being invaded by something chaotic, ancient, and alien, maps uncomfortably well onto the experience of a man who felt that his ordered world was being invaded by immigrants. The connection is real, and any intellectually honest engagement with Lovecraft must acknowledge it. But the second reading deserves equal attention, and it is ultimately more interesting as philosophy. On this reading, Lovecraft's racism is not the source of his cosmicism, but a failure to apply it consistently. Cosmicism, taken seriously, dissolves all human hierarchies. If human beings are a cosmic accident, briefly conscious on a minor planet, then the distinctions we draw among ourselves, by race, by nationality, by culture, are even more arbitrary than they would be in a universe that cared about us. The Anglo-Saxon heritage that Lovecraft prized so fiercely is, from a cosmic perspective, as meaningless as any other human variation. It is a local phenomenon within a local phenomenon, a footnote within a footnote. A consistent cosmicist would recognize this and would regard racial hierarchies as precisely the kind of parochial human projection that cosmicism claims to see through. Lovecraft did not recognize this. He preached the insignificance of all humanity while maintaining the significance of a particular branch of it. He saw through the illusion of cosmic meaning, but clung to the illusion of racial meaning. He understood with genuine philosophical clarity that the universe does not care about the human species, but he could not extend that insight to the conclusion that the universe does not care about the differences within the human species either. This is not merely a moral failure, though it is certainly that. It is an intellectual failure, a philosophical inconsistency that reveals the limits of his own thought. One might argue that this failure is so severe that it discredits the entire philosophy. If the man who formulated Cosmicism could not apply it consistently, then perhaps Cosmicism itself is merely a dressed-up version of provincial fear, a frightened man's projection given the appearance of philosophical rigour. This argument has been made, and it has weight. But it proves too much. If we reject every philosophical insight that its originator failed to live up to, we would have to reject most of the Western philosophical tradition. Rousseau wrote about the social contract while abandoning his children to foundling homes. Heidegger theorized about authenticity while collaborating with the Nazi regime. Thomas Jefferson declared that all men are created equal while holding human beings in slavery. The relationship between a thinker's ideas and a thinker's life is never simple, and the ideas must ultimately stand or fall on their own merits, independent of the character of the person who formulated them. The most charitable interpretation, and perhaps the most philosophically interesting one, is that Lovecraft's racism was a psychological defense against the implications of his own philosophy. If the universe is indifferent and human existence is meaningless, then belonging to a tradition, a culture, a racial lineage becomes one of the few sources of identity and stability available. Lovecraft clung to his Anglo-Saxon heritage because he had nothing else to cling to. He had no religious faith, no career success, no financial security, no stable family life. What he had was Providence and the colonial New England tradition, and the conviction that he belonged to a culture worth preserving. The racism was, on this reading, the last wall between Lovecraft and the full implications of his own cosmicism, the one area where he refused to let the acid of cosmic indifference dissolve his attachments. This does not excuse the racism, nothing excuses it, but it places it in a philosophical context that makes it intelligible, and it reveals something important about the philosophy itself. Cosmicism is not a comfortable position. It demands that you relinquish every claim to special status, every hierarchy, every framework of belonging that depends on the assumption that some human group is more significant than another. Lovecraft could not do this. He could see that humanity is insignificant in the cosmos, but he could not see that the racial categories within humanity are equally insignificant. The philosopher flinched at the full consequences of his own philosophy. There is a further dimension to this failure that is worth noting. Lovecraft's racism was not static. His later letters, particularly those written in the 1930s, after his return to Providence and his gradual emergence into a wider intellectual community show a measurable softening. He developed friendships with Jewish writers and correspondents, including the young Robert Bloch, who would go on to write Psycho, and the poet Samuel Loveman, whom Lovecraft knew to be Jewish, and with whom he maintained a genuine and affectionate correspondence. He expressed regret in some letters for the extremity of his earlier positions, acknowledging that his views had been shaped by ignorance and insularity. He moved in his final years toward what might be called a cultural rather than biological racism, still problematic but measurably less virulent than the raw ethnic loathing of the New York years. It would be a stretch to call the result tolerant by any modern standard. The softening matters because it suggests that the racism was not foundational to his identity in the way that some critics have argued. It was, at least in part, a product of circumstances, of isolation, of fear, of the specific miseries of the New York years, and it was capable of modification when circumstances changed. None of this resolves the tension, nor should we try to resolve it too neatly. Philosophical minds are not required to be consistent, and the inconsistencies of a thinker can be as revealing as their arguments. Lovecraft's racism reveals something important about the human relationship to ideas. We can hold a truth intellectually while failing to live it fully. We can see the implications of our own insights and still refuse to follow them to their conclusions. We can stand at the edge of the abyss, recognize that all human distinctions are cosmically meaningless, and then turn around and insist that some humans are better than others. The failure is real, but it is a very human failure, and it is worth understanding precisely because it shows how difficult it is to truly inhabit the kind of radical perspective that Cosmicism demands. Lovecraft remains a thinker whose greatest philosophical insight, the insignificance of humanity in an indifferent cosmos, coexists with his most conspicuous intellectual failure, the insistence on racial hierarchies within that insignificant humanity. We do not have to choose between these facts. We can hold them simultaneously as aspects of a single, complicated, deeply flawed mind that nevertheless saw something genuine about the nature of reality. The reader who refuses to engage with Lovecraft because of his racism is making an understandable choice. The reader who engages with Lovecraft while ignoring his racism is making a dishonest one. The most productive approach is to do what we do with any flawed thinker whose ideas have genuine power. Take the philosophy seriously, take the failure seriously, and understand that the relationship between the two is not incidental but illuminating. The philosophy is larger than the philosopher. It always is. But the philosopher's failures are part of the philosophy's history, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty, the kind that Lovecraft himself, in his better moments, would have condemned. Lovecraft never held an academic position. He never published in a philosophical journal. He never attended a conference, delivered a lecture, or presented his ideas in the systematic form that professional philosophers expect. He wrote pulp fiction for magazines that paid a cent a word on acceptance, when they paid at all, and that were printed on paper so cheap it disintegrated within a decade. He carried on his philosophical thinking in private letters that were not published until decades after his death. By every institutional measure, he was not a philosopher. And yet the ideas he developed have turned out to be more durable and more relevant than much of what was being produced in the philosophy departments of his day. The question worth asking now is where Cosmicism fits within the larger landscape of philosophical thought. What does it share with other traditions? Where does it diverge? And what, if anything, does it offer that no other philosophical position provides? The tradition to which Cosmicism bears the strongest family resemblance is philosophical pessimism. Arthur Schopenhauer, whose work Lovecraft read and admired, is the modern founder of this tradition. Schopenhauer argued that the fundamental nature of reality is a blind, ceaseless striving he called the will. The will is not a person. It has no goals, no purposes, no moral character. It simply drives, impelling every organism towards survival and reproduction in a process that generates suffering as its primary byproduct. Consciousness, in Schopenhauer's view, exists to serve the will, and the awareness that comes with consciousness is awareness predominantly of pain, lack, and dissatisfaction. The world, seen clearly, is a place of suffering, and the only genuine responses are aesthetic contemplation, which provides temporary escape, and ascetic renunciation, which offers a more permanent one. Lovecraft's Cosmicism shares Schopenhauer's conviction that the universe is not oriented toward human flourishing, and that clear-eyed recognition of this fact is devastating rather than liberating. But the differences are significant. Schopenhauer's pessimism is anthropocentric in its own way. The will strives through human beings. Human suffering is the center of the philosophical drama. The problem Schopenhauer addresses is the problem of human existence in a world structured by purposeless desire. Lovecraft's Cosmicism removes the human drama from the center entirely. It does not dethrone the human and place something else on the throne. It removes the throne. In his vision, the universe does not strive through us. It does not strive through anything. It simply operates, and our striving is a local event of no cosmic significance. The pessimist says the world is arranged to produce suffering. The cosmicist says the world is not arranged at all, and our suffering, like our joy, registers nowhere beyond the nervous systems that produce it. Friedrich Nietzsche, who built on Schopenhauer while attempting to overcome him, offers another point of comparison. Nietzsche accepted Schopenhauer's demolition of cosmic meaning, but refused the pessimistic conclusion. Where Schopenhauer counselled withdrawal, Nietzsche counselled engagement, the active creation of value through the will to power, the embrace of life in all its difficulty as something to be affirmed rather than endured. The death of God was not for Nietzsche a catastrophe, but an opportunity. It cleared the ground for a new kind of human greatness, unshackled from the life-denying values of Christianity. Lovecraft would have regarded this as magnificent self-deception. The will to power is still the will of a human being, and human will has no more cosmic significance than human suffering. To affirm life heroically in the face of meaninglessness is admirable as a psychological feat, but it changes nothing about the actual situation. The universe is not impressed by our heroism. It does not know we are being heroic. Existentialism, particularly in its mid-20th century forms, develops Nietzsche's response further. Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, that human beings have no fixed nature and must create themselves through their choices. Camus confronted the absurd, the gap between human desire for meaning and the universe's refusal to provide it, and argued that the only adequate response was revolt, continuing to live and to act in full awareness that one's actions have no ultimate justification. These are powerful philosophical positions, and they address a genuine problem. But from the cosmicist perspective, they remain trapped within the human bubble. They take the human experience of meaninglessness as the starting point and ask how a human being should respond. Lovecraft's Cosmicism questions the premise. Why should the universe's failure to provide meaning for human beings be treated as the central philosophical problem? It is a problem for us, certainly. But the universe contains trillions of planets on which no one is asking this question, and the question itself will disappear when the species that formulated it goes extinct. It is worth noting what is absent from this list of comparisons. Lovecraft has no Eastern counterpart. Buddhism, which might seem like a natural parallel with its teaching of impermanence and its dissolution of the self, arrives at a position that is superficially similar but fundamentally different. The Buddhist recognition that all things are impermanent and that the self is an illusion leads through the eightfold path to liberation. It is therapeutic. It offers a way out. Lovecraft offers no way out. His cosmicism does not lead to enlightenment or to the cessation of suffering. It leads to the recognition that suffering and enlightenment alike are human categories with no cosmic purchase. The Buddhist finds peace by releasing attachment to the self. The cosmicist finds nothing because there is nothing to find. There is only the cosmos, operating as it always has, with or without anyone looking. The philosopher who comes closest to Lovecraft's position, though he arrived at it by a very different route, is Thomas Ligotti. In The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, published in 2010, Ligotti presents a sustained philosophical argument for pessimism that draws explicitly on Lovecraft's vision. Ligotti's central claim is that consciousness is a curse, an evolutionary accident that allows human beings to perceive the horror of their own existence, the fact that they are biological machines, programmed to reproduce and die in a universe that is indifferent to their fate. Ligotti goes further than Lovecraft in some respects, arguing not merely that the universe is indifferent, but that consciousness itself is a malignant development, a disease that should ideally be eliminated. This is a bleaker position than anything Lovecraft explicitly endorsed, but it extends the cosmicist logic to its furthest conclusion. If human significance is a local illusion, then consciousness, the faculty that produces the illusion, is not a gift but a trap. Graham Harman, the philosopher associated with object-oriented ontology, has claimed Lovecraft for a very different philosophical project. In Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, published in 2012, Harman argues that Lovecraft's fiction demonstrates something fundamental about the nature of objects. In Harman's philosophy, objects are always more than what any other object, including a human mind, can perceive of them. They withdraw from full access. They have a reality that exceeds any relation. Lovecraft's fiction, with its repeated insistence that the entities his characters encounter are indescribable, incomprehensible, and irreducible to human categories, becomes, in Harman's reading, a literary enactment of this philosophical principle. The alien beings in Lovecraft are not merely frightening. They are philosophically inaccessible. They demonstrate the limits of all relation, the withdrawal that is built into the structure of reality itself. This is an inventive reading, and it has generated productive debate within contemporary philosophy. Harman's work brought Lovecraft into academic philosophical discourse in a way that no previous critic had managed, and it demonstrated that the fiction contains philosophical content capable of engaging with the most advanced theoretical frameworks of the 21st century. But it is worth noting that Harman's Lovecraft is a Lovecraft filtered through a specific philosophical framework that Lovecraft himself never articulated or endorsed. The object-oriented interpretation reveals something genuine about Lovecraft's fiction, the way it pushes against the limits of description and representation, the way it treats its entities as possessing a reality that exceeds any account of them. But it also risks domesticating the fiction by assimilating it into a philosophical system, which is precisely what Lovecraft's work resists. The power of cosmicism lies partly in its refusal to be a system. It is a vision, not a set of propositions. It can be described, but not formalized. Attempts to formalize it inevitably lose something, the way a chemical analysis of paint loses the painting. The ongoing academic interest in Lovecraft, from Harman to Thacker to Howell Beck and beyond, tells us something about the current moment in philosophy. We are living in an era when the data confirming Lovecraft's intuitions is accumulating faster than at any point in human history. The climate crisis reveals the planet as an active system operating on scales that dwarf human intervention. The discovery of thousands of exoplanets confirms that Earth is one world among billions. Advances in neuroscience suggest that consciousness may be less unified and less central than we have assumed. The philosophical traditions that treat the human subject as the starting point of all inquiry are under pressure from multiple directions. Lovecraft, from his rented room in Providence in the 1920s, was already writing from a position that these developments have made increasingly difficult to ignore. Eugene Thacker, whose In the Dust of This Planet appeared in 2011, takes yet another approach. Thacker is interested in what he calls the horror of philosophy, the point at which philosophical thinking encounters something it cannot think. He distinguishes between the world for us, the world as human beings experience and interpret it, the world in itself, the world as it exists independent of human perspectives, and the world without us, the world that is not merely independent of human perspectives, but actively excludes them. This third category, the world without us, is the territory of cosmic horror. It is the reality that remains when human consciousness is subtracted, and it is, by definition, unthinkable by human consciousness. Thacker's work provides the most rigorous philosophical vocabulary for what Lovecraft was doing in his fiction, precisely because Thacker takes seriously the possibility that there are features of reality that philosophy cannot reach. Michel Houellebecq's H.P. Lovecraft Against the World, Against Life, first published in French in 1991 and translated into English in 2005, approaches Lovecraft from the perspective of a novelist rather than a philosopher. Houellebecq reads Lovecraft as a radical refuser, a man who rejected the modern world in its entirety, who found no consolation in love, success, community, or any of the usual sources of human satisfaction, and who channeled this refusal into fiction of extraordinary intensity. Houellebecq's Lovecraft is not a philosopher seeking truth, but an artist driven by revulsion, a man who hated the world and transformed that hatred into a vision of the cosmos so complete and so uncompromising that it constitutes a kind of negative theology, a description of everything the universe is not from a human perspective. What Cosmicism offers that these other traditions do not is a specific orientation. Pessimism tells you the world is bad. Existentialism tells you the world is meaningless, but you can act anyway. Object-oriented ontology tells you that objects withdraw from access. The horror of philosophy tells you that thought has limits. Cosmicism tells you something simpler and stranger. It tells you that the universe is not about you, not in the sense that it fails to provide what you need, which is still a human-centered complaint, in the sense that you and everything you care about and every question you have ever asked occupy no place in its operations. You are not at the center. You are not at the margins. You are not on the map. The map does not include you because it was not drawn for you. It was not drawn for anyone. It was not drawn at all. There is something clarifying about this. Most philosophical positions try to help you. They try to provide a framework for living, a set of guidelines for navigating the difficulty of existence. Stoicism teaches acceptance. Epicureanism teaches pleasure. Existentialism teaches commitment. Even pessimism teaches a kind of resigned wisdom. Cosmicism teaches nothing, in the instructional sense. It describes. It shows you where you are. What you do with that information is your affair, and the cosmos will not notice either way. This is the unique contribution of Cosmicism to philosophical thought. It does not add another answer to the question of how to live meaningfully. It dissolves the question. Not by showing that it is poorly formulated, as a logical positivist might, but by revealing that the context in which it is asked, a universe scaled to human concerns, does not exist. The actual context, a universe scaled to processes and entities that dwarf human civilization to the point of invisibility, is one in which the question of meaning simply does not arise, except locally, temporarily, within the brief window of consciousness that evolution has produced on this particular world. Lovecraft did not invent this insight. Scientists had been providing the data for centuries, but he was among the first to feel it fully, to refuse every available consolation, and to find a literary form adequate to communicating what it feels like to stand in that knowledge without flinching. On the morning of March 15th, 1937, Howard Phillips Lovecraft died at Jane Brown Memorial Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. He was 46 years old. He had lived for less than half a century, most of it in a single city, almost all of it in obscurity. The cause was intestinal cancer, complicated by Bright's disease, a combination that had caused him excruciating pain for the final months of his life. He had been admitted to the hospital in early March after weeks of increasing pain, and his decline was swift. In his final days, he kept a diary of his symptoms, recording his deterioration with the same analytical detachment he had brought to everything else. The last entry is dated March 13th. 2 days later, he was gone. He died poor. He had never earned a living from his writing. The total income from his fiction over his entire career amounted to a few $100s. He had supplemented this with revision work, ghostwriting, and the small inherited income that had sustained him since his mother's death. He lived in rented rooms. He owned almost nothing of material value. His wardrobe was threadbare. He sometimes went without meals to save money for postage, because his correspondence, the vast, astonishing network of letters that connected him to the wider world, mattered more to him than food. He died obscure. Outside the small circle of Weird Tales readers and the larger but still marginal world of amateur journalism, almost no one knew his name. He had published no books during his lifetime. His stories existed only in the pages of pulp magazines, printed on cheap paper that yellowed and crumbled within years. He was convinced that his work would be forgotten, that whatever small reputation he had managed to build would evaporate within a generation. In a letter written not long before his death, he expressed the belief that his fiction would survive, if it survived at all, only as a minor curiosity in the history of the American pulp tradition. He was wrong. He was spectacularly, magnificently wrong. Within 2 years of his death, 2 of his correspondents, August Derleth and Donald Wandrei, founded Arkham House, a small press in Sauk City, Wisconsin, dedicated to preserving Lovecraft's work. The first Arkham House publication, The Outsider and Others, appeared in 1939 in an edition of 1,268 copies. It did not sell out for years, but it was the beginning of something that neither Derleth nor Wandrei could have anticipated. The books kept being reprinted. The readership kept growing. By the 1960s, propelled in part by a series of mass-market paperback editions, Lovecraft had been discovered by a new generation of readers who found in his fiction something that spoke to their own sense of alienation and cosmic unease. College students in the era of Vietnam and the space race encountered his work and recognized in it a vision of the universe that felt more honest than the optimistic narratives they were being offered elsewhere. By the 1970s, he was being taken seriously by literary critics and scholars, who began to argue that the line between popular fiction and serious literature was not as firm as the Academy had assumed. By the turn of the 21st century, he had been claimed by philosophers, visual artists, filmmakers, game designers, and musicians as one of the most influential imaginative writers of the modern era. The influence is pervasive and often invisible, woven so deeply into the fabric of contemporary culture that many people who have never read a word of Lovecraft have absorbed his ideas secondhand. The vocabulary of cosmic horror has become part of the common language. Words and concepts that Lovecraft invented or popularized, Cthulhu, the Necronomicon, Eldritch, The notion of ancient beings sleeping beneath the earth have migrated from pulp fiction into mainstream consciousness. The tentacled silhouette of Cthulhu appears on merchandise, in video games, on tattoos. The Lovecraftian aesthetic, the sense of a reality lurking beneath the surface of the familiar world that is too vast and too alien for human comprehension, has influenced everything from the novels of Stephen King and Thomas Ligotti to the films of John Carpenter and the television series True Detective. The weird fiction tradition that Lovecraft championed in supernatural horror in literature is now a thriving literary movement, with writers like China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and Laird Barron producing work that extends and transforms the cosmicist vision in ways Lovecraft could not have foreseen. But the cultural influence, as impressive as it is, matters less than the philosophical insight, and the insight endures because science keeps confirming it. In 1995, the Hubble Space Telescope was pointed at a seemingly empty patch of sky, a region about 1/13 the apparent diameter of the full moon, in the constellation Ursa Major. The resulting image, known as the Hubble Deep Field, revealed approximately 3,000 galaxies in that single tiny square of darkness. Each of those galaxies contains billions of stars. Each of those stars may have planets. The image was, in the most literal sense, a picture of Lovecraft's cosmos, a universe so vast that the human mind cannot meaningfully process the numbers, a universe in which the entire Earth, the entire solar system, the entire Milky Way galaxy is an infinitesimal speck in an ocean of space and time that extends in every direction beyond calculation. The discovery of extremophile organisms has revealed that life can exist in conditions that would be lethal to every organism visible to the naked eye. Bacteria, thriving in boiling hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. Microbes surviving in the radioactive cooling pools of nuclear reactors. Organisms living in the frozen darkness beneath Antarctic ice sheets, metabolizing so slowly that a single generation may span thousands of years. These discoveries have not merely expanded our understanding of where life can exist. They have undermined the assumption that life requires conditions similar to those on the Earth's surface. The universe may be teeming with life that bears no resemblance to anything we would recognize, life that exists according to principles we have not yet imagined. The scale of cosmic time has become, if anything, more vertiginous since Lovecraft's death. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. The Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. The first single-celled organisms appeared roughly 3.5 billion years ago. The first multicellular life emerged about 600 million years ago. The genus Homo has existed for approximately 2 million years. Modern Homo sapiens, anatomically and behaviorally like us, for perhaps 300,000. Written language has existed for about 5,000 years. All of recorded human history, every empire, every religion, every philosophical system, every war, every love affair, every birth and every death that anyone has ever known about, occupies a sliver of time so thin that it would be invisible on any accurate timeline of the universe. We are not merely brief. We are almost not here at all. And then there is the matter of dark matter and dark energy. Current cosmological models suggest that the matter we can observe, all the stars, all the galaxies, all the nebulae and planets and moons and asteroids and dust, constitutes approximately 5% of the total mass energy content of the universe. The remaining 95% is composed of dark matter and dark energy, phenomena that we can detect indirectly through their gravitational effects, but that we cannot see, touch, or explain. We do not know what they are. We know they are there because the universe behaves as though they are there. We live in a cosmos that is, by mass, almost entirely composed of something we cannot perceive or understand. Lovecraft would have recognized this immediately. It is the cosmic indifference he described, rendered in the language of 21st century physics. Consider what it would have meant to Lovecraft to know these things. He died in 1937, before the first electronic computers, before the discovery of DNA, before the Big Bang theory was confirmed by the detection of the cosmic microwave background radiation in 1965. He intuited, from the science available to him, a universe of staggering scale and absolute indifference. He could not have imagined how much the science that followed his death would confirm and exceed his intuitions. The universe is not merely larger than he thought, it is stranger. It contains phenomena, black holes, neutron stars, gravitational waves, quantum entanglement that are as alien to everyday human experience as anything in his fiction. The weird, it turns out, is not confined to the pages of pulp magazines. It is the actual texture of the cosmos we inhabit. All of this raises the question that Lovecraft's work has been asking since the opening of the Call of Cthulhu. What does it mean to live honestly in a universe that does not care whether you exist? The easy answer is that it means despair. If nothing we do has cosmic significance, if our species is a temporary arrangement of matter on an unremarkable world, if the universe will continue without noticing our absence, then what is the point? Why build anything? Why love anyone? Why get out of bed in the morning? But Lovecraft himself, for all his philosophical bleakness, got out of bed every morning. Or rather, he got out of bed every evening, since he was a night creature by preference. He wrote stories that he poured himself into, despite knowing they might never find an audience. He wrote letters by the thousands, letters full of warmth, humour, detailed observations about architecture and history, passionate arguments about literature and philosophy, gentle encouragement to young writers who sought his advice. He maintained friendships that mattered deeply to him. He walked the streets of Providence and found them beautiful. He lived, in short, as though life was worth living, even as he believed that life had no cosmic significance. This is not a contradiction. It is, in fact, the most interesting thing about the cosmicist position. The absence of cosmic meaning does not eliminate local meaning. It relocates it. Love matters, not because the universe endorses it, but because we are the kind of creatures for whom love is real. Curiosity matters, not because the universe rewards inquiry, but because the experience of understanding something new is intrinsically valuable to the mind that achieves it. Beauty matters, not because it reflects a cosmic order, but because the perception of beauty is one of the things consciousness can do, and it is among the best of them. Lovecraft knew this. He lived this. He simply refused to pretend that these local meanings had cosmic backing. He refused to tell the comfortable lie that because something matters to us, it must matter to the universe. The universe does not matter to itself. It does not have a self. It is not the kind of thing that can care about anything. And in the space left by that recognition, a space that is terrifying when you first enter it, and strangely peaceful once you have been there for a while, it is possible to find something that might be called dignity. Not the dignity of a species chosen by God or placed at the center of creation. The quieter dignity of a species that looked into the void, understood what it saw, and kept going anyway. We are small. We are brief. We are probably alone, or if we are not alone, we are surrounded by things we cannot comprehend. And we are here, tonight, conscious, aware, listening to one another's voices across the dark. That may not be enough, measured against the scale of the cosmos. But it is what we have. And there is something honest, and perhaps even beautiful, in refusing to pretend it is more than it is. Lovecraft wrote his last letter on March 14th, 1937, the day before he died. He was in pain. He was alone in a hospital room in the city he had loved all his life. The city whose colonial streets he had walked for decades in the small hours of the morning, looking up at the stars that did not know his name. He had no way of knowing that his vision of cosmic horror would one day reshape contemporary culture, that philosophers would write books about his ideas, that millions of people around the world would read his stories and find in them something that no other writer had given them. The experience of confronting the indifference of the universe and surviving the confrontation. He would have found the attention bewildering. He would have been pleased. The stars are still there. They are still indifferent. And we are still here, looking up. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you want to vote on what comes next, you can do that on our website, slphilosophyradio.com. While you are there, check out the full transcript, works cited, recommended reading list, and some other materials we put together for this one. You can find all the links down in the description. If you enjoyed this, a like, a subscribe, or just sharing this video with someone who might appreciate it really does make a difference. And I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What stood out to you? What do you want to hear next? Until next time, take care.